There is a version of you that only comes out when no one is watching. Not a hidden version, not a secret one, just the one that moves at its own pace, thinks its own thoughts without editing them first, and exists without any awareness of how it appears. You might notice it on a morning when the house is empty and you are not performing anything for anyone, not even slightly. You make something to eat and you stand at the window for longer than you meant to. You are not bored. You are not lonely. You are, in some way that is hard to name, completely fine. And then someone comes home, or you go out, or the phone rings, and that version of you folds back up. Not dramatically, just quietly, like a cat that was napping in a warm spot and simply gets up and leaves when the room changes. Some people feel this acutely. They spend time with people they genuinely love and conversations they genuinely enjoy and still come away with a kind of pleasant exhaustion. They need, sometimes urgently, to be alone. Not to escape, not because anything went wrong, just to return to themselves. So the question worth sitting with is this: why do some people feel most like themselves when no one else is there? This is not a character flaw. It is not a social problem. It is, in fact, a deeply understood and recognized dimension of how certain nervous systems work. And if it describes you, it may be something you have quietly wondered about for years without ever quite having language for it. The most familiar framework is introversion, and it is worth explaining plainly rather than relying on how the word gets used casually. Introversion, in the way psychologists describe it, is not really about shyness, and it is not about disliking people. It is about where your energy comes from and where it goes. For people who lean introverted, social engagement, even enjoyable social engagement, draws on something. It costs something, whereas time alone restores it. This is not a metaphor. The nervous system is genuinely processing more when other people are present. There are signals to read, cues to respond to, a self to manage in relation to others. The brain is doing more work. And some brains find that more effortful than others. The extrovert equivalent is almost the opposite. Solitude for those people can feel a bit like running out of fuel. They need the contact, the stimulation, the exchange. Neither way of being is better. They are simply different operating conditions. But introversion is only part of the story, because even among people who identify strongly as introverted, there is variation. Some feel restored by quiet, but can move easily back into groups. Others have a much more specific experience of solitude, less like recharging a battery and more like finally being allowed to breathe properly. For them, alone does not just mean restful, it means real. And that distinction is worth exploring. There is a layer beneath introversion that has to do with self-monitoring. Psychologists use this term to describe how much attention a person pays to how they come across in social situations. High self-monitors are constantly reading the room, adjusting their tone, choosing their words with awareness of how they land. Low self-monitors tend to behave consistently regardless of who is watching. Most people fall somewhere in between, but many people who feel most themselves in solitude are quietly running a very active monitoring process around others without realizing quite how much energy it takes. You might recognize this as the slight difference between how you tell a story to a friend and how you tell it in your head. In your head, it does not need to be paced correctly or softened at the edges or made more acceptable. It just is what it is. When you speak it aloud to someone else, even someone you trust, some part of you is listening to yourself as you go, checking it, shaping it. That editing process is normal and social and entirely human. But for some people, it is almost always running. And that means solitude is the only place where it switches off. There is also something to be said about the relationship between aloneness and identity itself. When we are with other people, we are always in some kind of relationship with their perception of us. We are the funny one, or the quiet one, or the responsible one. We are the person who always orders the sensible thing, or the one who talks too much when nervous. These roles are not dishonest. They emerge from real aspects of who we are, but they are partial. They are facets, not the whole. And over time, especially for people who move through a lot of social roles, there can be a creeping sense of being assembled from other people's impressions rather than from something solid inside. Solitude for those people is not isolation, it is integration. It is the place where all the different versions of themselves can be in the same room at once. No role required, no performance, however minor, just the whole unedited thing. This is not a new observation. William James, one of the early figures in American psychology, wrote about the way a person has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize them. That idea has held up. We are genuinely different with different people, and there is nothing wrong with that. But it means being alone can feel like the only time you are fully singular. And then there is the question of what some people were taught about being alone. For some, solitude was something they sought out as children, not because they were antisocial, but because they needed to process things. A child who goes quiet after a difficult day, who retreats to their room not in upset, but in some instinctive need to settle, often grows into an adult who still works that way. The alone time is where things get sorted. Not spoken through, not analyzed with someone else, just internally arranged into something manageable. For those people, other people in the processing space can feel not unwelcome exactly, but premature, like being asked to talk about something before you have figured out what you think about it. This is not the same as avoidance. It is actually a coherent and functional way of working through experience. Some people need conversation to understand themselves. Others need quiet. Neither path is more emotionally honest than the other. They are simply different routes to the same place. So what do you do with this if it describes you? The gentle shift here is not about changing how you work. It is about giving yourself permission to take it seriously as a genuine feature of how you are built, rather than something to apologize for or manage around. Because people who feel most themselves when alone often spend a surprising amount of energy pretending otherwise. They push through social obligations past the point of genuine enjoyment, worried that leaving early makes them seem cold. They fill their weekends with plans because emptiness seems suspect. They say yes when they mean no, and then feel vaguely resentful of a choice they made themselves. The small practical thing is simply to stop treating your need for solitude as a need you have to justify. You do not have to be an introvert on a quiz before it counts. You do not have to be exhausted to earn an evening alone. If quiet is where you come back to yourself, that is information worth honoring rather than overriding. It also helps to notice, without judgment, when the need for solitude shifts into avoidance of something specific. There is a difference between choosing aloneness because it genuinely restores you and choosing it because a particular relationship or situation has become too uncomfortable to face. The first is self-knowledge. The second is worth being gently curious about. Not harsh with yourself, just curious. What is it specifically that the company of others is making harder to ignore right now? And as a small note, if any of this touches something that feels bigger than a quiet preference, something that feels like difficulty rather than just disposition, it is always worth talking to someone who can actually help with that. This is general reflection, not a substitute for real support. But for most people who feel this, it is not difficulty. It is just how they are. And there is something quietly freeing about understanding that the version of you that exists in solitude is not a lesser or more hidden version. It might actually be the most complete one, the one that exists before the shaping begins, the one that knows what it thinks before it decides how to say it. You spend so much time being someone in relation to someone else. It makes sense that you sometimes need to be something simpler, just yourself, in a quiet room, taking up exactly as much space as you feel like taking up, with no one watching and nothing to perform. That is not loneliness. That is something closer to home. If this felt like something you needed to hear, there are new episodes on this channel every day. You are welcome to come back whenever you want something to sit quietly with.